Tracing the Rise of the 1% Label in TNT by Shaliza Hassanali. It's a phrase that stirs emotions in TNT, the 1% commonly associated with the Syrian-Lebanese community. On June 10th, Attorney General John Jeremy singled out the community using that phrase, the 1%, and alluded to that community being a gang. This week, Guardian Media examines the 1% class narrative and the perception it's shaped for that community. In June of 2017, a single segment on the late chef Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown culinary television show sparked a major conversation in TNT. It threw the nation's Syrian-Lebanese community into the spotlight, who were later branded as the country's 1%. Local businessman Mario Sabgoboud, who was one of several guests on Bourdain's culinary and travel documentary, described the Syrian-Lebanese community as the smallest but most powerful. Businessman Peter George, who was seated at the dinner table, estimated the community at under 5,000. George said that at one time the country had a huge middle class, which was a sort of security in terms of any possible conflict between the haves and have-nots. Sabgoboud apologized following a firestorm of criticism from fellow citizens who felt his remarks were insensitive and irresponsible. There were also calls on social media for his chain of restaurants to be boycotted. Ian Smart, director of Smart Energy, also staged a one-man protest in front of Rituals in Maryville against what he said was control by the 1%. Since then, the 1% narrative has stirred both curiosity and controversy. The term 1% is used to describe the wealthiest business people and politically influential groups, particularly in the context of economic and social disparities. Over the years, politicians and union leaders have publicly used the narrative freely. Days after Bourdain's TV episode was aired, the Oilfields Workers Trade Union, OWTU, President General Ansel Roger called for a boycott of those businesses owned by the nation's 1% ruling class. Addressing the union's 78th annual conference, Roger said workers had to understand the nature of the battle, saying the elite in society had built their empires on the backs of the working class. Roger said that this group had become so emboldened that they had stepped forward to identify themselves as the smallest but most powerful, who had control over the rest of us. In the face of Roger's call, the American Chamber of Commerce of TNT, AmCham, issued a statement stating that the union leaders' comments were not only unfortunate but counterproductive. In every country where a minority has been persecuted in an attempt to shift power or influence to another group, the result has been economic and social decay, AmCham said in its statement. AmCham said it believed that statements such as these are very divisive and not in the best interest of the very workers that they are supposed to represent. How the phrase entered politics. At a PNM meeting in San Fernando in September 2018, then Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley lashed out at UNC leader Kamla Persad-Bissessar for referencing him as an Oreo, controlled by the 1%. Speaking to party supporters, Rowley made no apology for representing the largest bloc of Syrians, Arabs and Lebanese in his Diego Martin West constituency, as he slammed Persad-Bissessar, then opposition leader, for descending into gutter politics. During a UNC Monday night forum in Claxton Bay, Persad-Bissessar had said, "They 1% tried to own Mr. Patrick Manning, but they couldn't do that. They tried to own me, but I sent them packing. They have their Oreo now, who is their guy, and Keith Christopher Rowley, and that's how the 1% friends and family of Rowley controls him." Despite calls for Persad-Bissessar to apologize, she said there was not an iota of racism in her statement. The following year, during a Labor Day celebration in Faizabad, Roger stated that the trade union movement and working class were under attack by the then PNM government and 1%, just for speaking the truth. This year, in her second turn as Prime Minister, Persad-Bissessar announced the establishment of a government committee to explore strategies for the reopening of the Petrotrin refinery. During this year's Labor Day celebrations in Faizabad, she told hundreds of workers that she was part of them and not the 1%. AG's controversial statement. On June 10th, the phrase took another turn when Attorney General John Jeremy, in identifying gangs in Parliament, said the phrase 1% alluded to the Syrian-Lebanese community as a gang. At the time, he was signaling the government's intention to intensify its crackdown on organized crime, stating that authorities would pursue white-collar criminals and those who facilitate criminal activities, regardless of their wealth, status, or influence. His comments generated public discussion, particularly among members of that community, some of whom have interpreted the rhetoric as unfairly casting suspicion on successful business families. Businessman Gary Aboud rejected the AG's suggestion, saying the issue had evolved beyond politics and was now touching on questions of race, identity, and national unity. Aboud said he was troubled by what he viewed as an emerging narrative that equates financial success with criminal conduct. The Prime Minister, however, threw her full support behind the AG's warning that no segment of society, including the 1%, is beyond the reach of the law, alleging that some current and former senior banking officials facilitated foreign currency transactions for local businesses linked to international drug cartels. Government Senator Philip Alexander also defended Jeremy's controversial use of the term 1% during the debate on the extension of the state of emergency 3 weeks ago, arguing that the phrase is globally associated with wealth and privilege rather than any specific ethnic group. I have Syrian ancestry and, unfortunately, tagging the word 1% to the Syrian community happened in a video that was done with Anthony Bourdain and that went viral on its own, Alexander said. But globally, the term 1% refers to the top 1% of the wealthiest people in the country. That is why we are the 99% as a movement. Opposition Senator Faris Al-Rawi disagreed with Alexander's defense, insisting that the AG's comments could only reasonably be interpreted as a reference to the Syrian-Lebanese community. He started by reading the wording from Peter George in an Anthony Bourdain interview. After he had done that, he then made reference to 1% ownership of media, which could only be the Sabga family. Tluxing, economic powerhouse. For decades, the 1% has not only solidified its socioeconomic position but also extended its influence over policies, business trends, and investment directions in the country. This is according to University of the West Indies lecturer and historian Dr. Jerome Tluxing, who told Guardian Media in an interview last Friday that it was difficult to eliminate the 1% because they are entrenched in our society. The term 1% generally refers to the wealthiest and most influential within small, privileged circles. This group, referred to as the Syrian-Lebanese community, is said to hold a large portion of wealth, property, and power within the economy. Dismantling them could lead to negative consequences. The entire 1% class cannot simply be seen as an economic enemy. We also need to be mindful that among the 1% are those whose business acumen and entrepreneurship enabled them to positively contribute to our society. He emphasized the complexity of the 1%'s role, noting that while they hold significant economic power, their contribution can also be beneficial. The historian said it was difficult to determine the exact year or moment when the 1% narrative originated. All societies have social pyramids or hierarchies. One's position at the top, as 1% on the pyramid, could be determined by one or more factors such as ethnicity, religion, wealth, nationality, occupation, family background, and skin color. Tluxing recalled that former union leader and Prime Minister Bastio Pandey regularly used the term parasitic oligarchy, which he referred to as the 1% who had political leverage and controlled the financial institutions. The term 1% was not used, but the public certainly knew the privileged, elite, and influential. During the country's early history, Tluxing said there were the privileged elites, Spanish, French, and British. Some belonged to the planter class and would have been considered the 1%. And as a result of generational wealth, their descendants continue to enjoy this influential status and wealth. Today, in Trinidad and Tobago, we tend to make a simplistic classification and identify all white and near-white persons as belonging to the 1%. He said it was easy to assume that the wealthiest of the Syrian-Lebanese community belonged to the 1%. The 1% group is neither exclusive nor static. It has evolved and will continue to do so. The reality is that there have been changes as a very small percentage of persons of other ethnic groups, with similar wealth, are part of this exclusive 1% club. Over the years, Tluxing said the Syrian-Lebanese community have faced pushback over the 1% narrative. It created a level of mistrust and would have damaged race and ethnic relations. Tilak Singh recalled that during the Black Power movement in the 1970s, some of the people in the Syrian community were fearful of being attacked. But he said it is wrong to generalize and stereotype an entire group as lawbreakers. The reality is that those who are guilty of being involved in crime will tarnish the image of the entire ethnic group. The 1% narrative has also been heavily politicized. The public believes that one political party is given financial support and other advantages by the 1%, whilst the other political parties are ignored. Tilak Singh said the 1% narrative has affected business for the Syrian-Lebanese community. However, loyal customers will continue to support their business. We like gossip that maligns others. So it will be no surprise to hear derogatory remarks continually being made about their businesses. Tilak Singh said while Prime Minister Kamla Persad is supporting Attorney General John Jeremy's warning that no segment of society, including the so-called 1%, is beyond a reach of the law, they should not be worried, as only those who have acted unlawfully would be targeted and brought to justice by the state.